September 7th, 1940. The air over the French coast is clear and sharp. Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall of the Greater German Reich and head of the Luftwaffe, raises his binoculars. He scans the white cliffs of Dover, just 20 miles away across the calm water of the English Channel. A confident smile plays on his lips. His intelligence chief, Colonel Joseph Beppo Schmid, has just presented him with the latest reports. The reconnaissance photos are undeniable. British airfields in the southeast of England are a ruin. Hangars are twisted skeletons of steel. Runways are pockmarked with craters. Burnt-out husks of Spitfires and Hurricanes litter the grass. The reports conclude that Britain's Royal Air Force, Fighter Command, is on its last legs. They are down to perhaps 50, maybe 100 serviceable fighters. The battle is won. Today, Göring has decided to shift the focus of the attack. He will unleash the full might of his bomber fleets on London itself, to break the will of the British people and force their surrender. It is a logical, almost merciful next step. Why continue to waste bombs on airfields that are already out of action? The war, he believes, will be over in a matter of weeks. He lowers his binoculars, satisfied. The math is simple. The evidence is clear. But Göring and his entire high command are victims of a colossal misunderstanding. They are about to make the single greatest strategic blunder of the Battle of Britain, because the truth, hidden in the smoke and chaos, is something their rigid, logical minds cannot comprehend. The RAF is not broken. It's not even close. In fact, as Göring watches, dozens of British fighters are being refueled and rearmed on those very same destroyed airfields, ready to rise and meet his bombers. The question is, how? How could an entire air force, photographed in a state of utter destruction, continue to operate at peak efficiency? The answer isn't just about courage or fighting spirit. It's a story of incredible ingenuity, a secret war of deception, and a level of grit and improvisation that the German war machine had fatally underestimated. They were looking at the truth, but they simply couldn't see it. To understand the scale of the German miscalculation, we must step into the mind of the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch. Colonel Beppo Schmid was a methodical, data-driven officer. His department, Abteilung 5, was the brain of the Luftwaffe. They relied on what they could see, on what they could prove. Their primary tool was the camera. High-altitude reconnaissance aircraft, like the Dornier 17, would race across the channel, flying at incredible speeds and heights, their automated cameras clicking away, capturing thousands of images of southern England. Back at their headquarters in France, these images were painstakingly analyzed. Photo interpreters, men trained to spot the smallest detail, would pore over the prints with magnifying glasses. They counted aircraft. They identified hangars, fuel depots, and command centers. And when a bombing raid was successful, the evidence was undeniable. A photograph from 10 a.m. would show an intact airfield. A photograph from 4 p.m. after a visit from 100 German bombers would show a scene of total devastation. Craters would sever runways. Hangars would be flattened. Black smoke would be pouring from fuel dumps. The conclusion was simple and logical. That airfield was no longer a threat. Schmid would prepare his reports for Göring, complete with before and after pictures. The message was consistent. Fighter Command is being systematically wiped out. They tallied the number of destroyed British aircraft, both on the ground and in the air, and their numbers painted a picture of an enemy on the verge of collapse. They believed the RAF was a brittle organization. Destroy its bases, and the entire structure would shatter. They saw the airfields as factories, and they were methodically smashing the machinery. What they failed to account for was the human element. They couldn't photograph improvisation. They couldn't quantify the stubborn refusal to quit. Their cameras showed them craters, but they couldn't see the teams of men who would swarm those craters the moment the bombers left, working through the night to fill them. They saw wrecked hangars, but they didn't see the Spitfires that had been cleverly dispersed and hidden in nearby woods and farms before the attack even began. Their intelligence was accurate in what it saw, but completely blind to what it couldn't. They were fighting a visible war of bombs and bullets, while the British were fighting an invisible war of repair, camouflage, and sheer, bloody-minded determination. And this blindness would lead the Luftwaffe to make a fatal error. Convinced that the airfields were no longer a primary target, they turned their attention to London, giving Fighter Command the one thing it needed more than anything else: a moment to breathe. Let's not understate the reality on the ground for the Royal Air Force in late August and early September of 1940. It was hell. The German intelligence photographs were not fake. The damage was real, and it was catastrophic. Airfields in Sector 11, the crucial southeastern corner of England protecting London, were taking a relentless pounding. Places like Kenley, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, and Manston were on the front line. Manston, right on the coast of Kent, was bombed so frequently and so heavily that it had to be abandoned for frontline operations. Pilots would land there only to refuel before taking off again from the cratered runways, if they could. At Biggin Hill, one of the most famous fighter stations, a single raid on August 30th killed 39 ground personnel and destroyed every workshop, store, and office. The operations room, the nerve center of the station, was hit, and the vital communication lines were severed. For a few critical hours, the station was effectively blind and deaf. Pilots and ground crew alike were living and working in a state of constant exhaustion and fear. They were being bombed day and night. Sleep was a luxury, snatched in hastily dug trenches or under the relative safety of a sturdy table. The air was thick with the smell of cordite, burning oil, and churned earth. The sirens became the soundtrack to their lives. A moment of quiet was more unnerving than the noise of an attack. It just meant the next wave was on its way. One young pilot described landing his Hurricane after a dogfight, his fuel tanks almost empty and his ammunition spent, only to see the ground crews running towards him, waving him away from the hangars. A formation of Junkers 88 bombers was appearing on the horizon. He had no choice but to take off again immediately, with no fuel and no bullets, hoping to bluff the bombers into breaking formation. This was the daily reality. The system was bending, and it was close to breaking. The official history states that during this period, the damage to the sector stations and their communication systems was the most critical threat to the defense of Britain. More critical than pilot losses, more critical than aircraft shortages. If the airfields could not function, the fighters could not fly. No matter how many brave pilots or brilliant Spitfires Britain had, without a runway to take off from, a command center to guide them, and a ground crew to patch them up, they were useless. The Germans were right. Their strategy was working. They were strangling Fighter Command at its bases. What they didn't know was that the British had a plan, or rather, a series of desperate, ingenious, and brilliantly simple plans that were about to be put into action. The man at the center of this defense was Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding. Known as Stuffy by his men, he was a reserved, often difficult man, but he was a visionary. Years before the war, Dowding had overseen the creation of the world's first integrated air defense system. It was a weapon of war, unlike any other, a system that connected radar stations, observer posts, command centers, and fighter squadrons into a single, cohesive network. It was designed to do one thing: get the right number of fighters to the right place at the right time. The radar stations, a chain of tall masts along the coast, were the eyes of the system. They could detect incoming German aircraft long before they reached England. This information was then fed back to a central hub, Fighter Command Headquarters at Bentley Priory. There, in a vast room, women of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, would plot the enemy's course on a giant map table using long wooden rakes. Dowding, or his controllers, could watch the battle unfold in real time. From this central hub, orders would be passed down to the group headquarters, and then to the sector stations, the very airfields like Kenley and Biggin Hill that were now being bombed into oblivion. The sector operations rooms were the crucial link. They would receive the information about the incoming raid and scramble the specific squadrons needed to intercept it. The whole system, known as the Dowding system, was a marvel of technology and organization. It allowed the RAF, which was always outnumbered, to husband its resources, to refuse to be drawn into a massive dogfight over the channel where the Germans wanted to fight. Instead, they could pick their battles, meeting the bombers with precision over British soil. But the Germans, through their relentless attacks, had identified the weak link in this chain: the sector stations. If you could destroy the operations room at Biggin Hill, you could sever its connection to the rest of the system. You could blind that section of the defense. If you destroyed the runways, the fighters were grounded. Dowding understood this threat better than anyone. He knew that his brilliant system was only as strong as its physical infrastructure. Long before the battle began, he had pushed for measures to make his airfields more resilient. He advocated for hardened underground bunkers for the operations rooms, for dispersing aircraft away from the main hangars, and for creating backup plans. But even he could not have foreseen the sheer ferocity of the Luftwaffe's assault. As the bombs fell on his crucial sector stations, he and his commanders were faced with a stark choice: find a new way to keep these airfields alive, or lose the battle, and with it, the country. The answer would come not from new technology or grand strategy, but from something far more fundamental: the art of illusion. The idea was born out of desperation and genius. Its chief architect was a man named Colonel John F. Turner, an engineer from the Air Ministry. His official title was Director of Works and Buildings, a typically understated British name for the man who would become the master illusionist of the RAF. As the German bombers began to systematically target the airfields, Turner and his team were confronted with a simple, brutal problem. How do you protect a target that is, by its very nature, enormous, static, and impossible to hide? An airfield needs long, flat runways, large hangars, and numerous support buildings. From 10,000 feet, it's a giant bullseye painted on the landscape. The conventional answer was active defense, anti-aircraft guns and fighter patrols. But that wasn't enough. Turner's solution was radical. If you can't hide the real target, he argued, then you must create fake ones. You must give the enemy something else to bomb. It was a concept as old as warfare itself, the decoy. But Turner's team would elevate it to an art form on an industrial scale. They devised a two-pronged strategy. First, they would create brand new, entirely fake airfields, designed to look real from the air. These were the K-sites. Second, they would create decoy lighting systems for night attacks, simulating the appearance of a real airfield preparing for night operations. These were the Q sites. It was a massive gamble. It would require enormous resources, manpower, and a deep understanding of the enemy's mindset. They had to think like a German reconnaissance pilot. They had to understand what a photo interpreter in France was looking for. Every detail had to be perfect. A poorly made decoy is worse than no decoy at all. It confirms to the enemy where the real target isn't. The plan was met with skepticism by some, but with the bombs raining down on Kenley and Biggin Hill, Dowding and the Air Ministry knew they had to try anything. The order was given, and across the fields and farmlands of Britain, a secret army of builders, artists, and engineers began their work. They were about to construct the largest stage production in history, with the Luftwaffe as their unwilling audience. Their goal was simple: to fool the sharpest eyes in the German military and draw their deadly payload of bombs onto empty fields, saving the real airfields to fight another day. The K-sites were the daytime decoys, masterpieces of theatrical engineering. The goal was to build an airfield that looked completely real to a reconnaissance pilot flying at 30,000 feet, or to his camera lens. The construction had to be fast, cheap, and convincing. The aircraft for these phantom airfields were the stars of the show. They were built by a variety of people, from film studio prop makers at Sound City and Shepperton Studios to local carpenters. They were full-scale models of Hurricanes and Spitfires, but they were little more than wooden skeletons covered in canvas. They were designed to be flimsy, lightweight, and easy to move around. From a distance, they were perfect replicas. Up close, they were crude fakes. To add to the realism, ground crews would periodically move the dummy aircraft around the field to simulate the daily activity of a real base. Sometimes, they would even create fake tracks in the grass, as if a plane had just taxied to a new position. The buildings were just as fake. They constructed dummy hangars, barracks, and maintenance sheds. These were often just wooden frames with canvas or plywood walls, painted to look like brick or corrugated iron. From the air, they cast the right shadows, had the right shape, and gave the impression of a busy, operational base. But the real genius was in the details. The deception artists understood that a real airfield is messy. So they added details to create what they called purposeful untidiness. They would scatter oil drums around, create fake bomb craters from previous attacks, and even use plows to carve fake runways and taxiways into the grass. They would light small, smoky fires to simulate a workshop or a cookhouse. They would even have a single vehicle, perhaps an old truck, drive around the decoy airfield during the day to create tracks and give the impression of life and activity. The location of these K-sites was crucial. They had to be close enough to a real airfield to be a plausible alternative, but far enough away that a stray bomb wouldn't hit the real thing. They were often built on land that had been surveyed for potential real airfields, so the terrain was appropriate. By September of 1940, there were dozens of these phantom airfields dotted across the country, and the Germans started to take the bait. Luftwaffe reconnaissance planes would photograph these new, pristine airfields. Photo interpreters would identify them as satellite or dispersal fields for the main RAF bases. They would be added to the target lists. Soon, bombs intended for places like North Weald or Debden were falling harmlessly on empty fields, destroying canvas planes and plywood sheds, all while the real fighters at the real airfields continued to operate, often just a few miles away. Each bomb that fell on a K-site was a victory for Colonel Turner's secret army. It was a bomb that didn't crater a real runway, didn't kill a real mechanic, and didn't destroy a real Spitfire. While the K-sites were designed to fool the cameras of daytime reconnaissance planes, the Q-sites were built for a different, more terrifying purpose: to deceive bomber crews in the dead of night. Night bombing was notoriously inaccurate in 1940. Crews relied on moonlight, landmarks, and dead reckoning to find their targets. An airfield at night was a vast patch of darkness, but it had a distinct signature when it was active. The key was the lighting. A real airfield preparing to land or launch aircraft would use a specific pattern of lights: a flare path to guide the pilot in, obstruction lights on tall buildings, and the faint, hooded lights of vehicles moving around. The goal of a Q site was to mimic this lighting pattern perfectly, creating an irresistible target for a bomber crew searching for their mark in the dark. The Q sites were often just empty fields, miles away from any real airfield. The equipment was brilliantly simple. The runway lights were created using basic electrical bulbs hidden inside wooden boxes or metal biscuit tins, with a cowled opening to direct the light upwards. These would be laid out in the precise pattern of a real flare path. They were powered by a small, mobile generator, hidden some distance away. A 2- or 3-man crew would operate the entire site from a nearby ditch or a small, sandbagged bunker. Their job was one of the most dangerous in the entire war. They would wait for the sound of approaching German bombers. Then, on a signal from a central command, they would turn on their lights, simulating an airfield coming to life. For the German bombardier, looking down from 10,000 feet, this sudden appearance of a perfect runway pattern in the darkness was an answered prayer. It was the target, laid out for them. They would line up their bombing run, and the crew of the Q site would wait, listening to the whistle of the falling bombs, huddled in their trench. As soon as the first bombs started to fall, their job was to start turning the lights on and off, to simulate the chaos and damage of a real raid. They might extinguish one section of the runway and turn on red lights to simulate fires. They had special effects too. The hotbox was a device that used troughs of oil and water to create dramatic flashes and sparks when lit, mimicking the effect of bombs hitting electrical equipment. The courage of these Q-site crews was extraordinary. They were deliberately making themselves the target. Their only defense was a shallow trench and the hope that the German bombardier's aim wasn't perfect. But their work saved countless lives and priceless aircraft. Throughout the Blitz, hundreds of tons of bombs were dropped on these empty fields. The Germans would fly home, reporting the successful destruction of an RAF night fighter base, while the real base, just a few miles away, remained untouched, its pilots and planes safe, ready to rise and defend the cities. Beyond the creation of entirely fake airfields, there was a parallel effort that was just as important: hiding what was real. The art of camouflage became a critical weapon in the defense of Britain. The goal was to make the real, operational airfields as invisible as possible, or at least to disguise their most vital components. This task fell to a special branch of the Royal Engineers, but they recruited some unlikely experts: magicians, artists, and film set designers from London's creative industries. These were people who understood perspective, shadow, and illusion. One of the leading figures was the stage magician, Jasper Maskelyne, who claimed to have used mirrors and clever lighting to make entire factories disappear. While some of his claims were exaggerated, the principle was real. The teams were led by people like Colonel Conway Lloyd Morgan, who brought a scientific approach to the problem. They studied German reconnaissance photos to see what their own airfields looked like from above. They realized that the sharp, geometric shapes of hangars, runways, and buildings stood out starkly against the irregular patterns of the English countryside. The solution was to break up these shapes. They used vast nets, garnished with painted fabric and steel wool, to cover hangars and workshops. These nets would disrupt the hard edges and shadows, making a large building blend into the surrounding fields. They painted runways with dark, drab colors to make them look like grass from a distance. They even painted fake hedge and field patterns directly onto the concrete to further the illusion. The crucial command centers and operations rooms, once housed in obvious brick buildings, were moved into heavily sandbagged and camouflaged bunkers, or sometimes into requisitioned country houses nearby. At RAF Hornchurch, the sector operations room was moved into a large private house called Highlands, which was much harder for the Germans to identify as a key military target. Aircraft dispersal was another key tactic. Instead of lining up valuable Spitfires and Hurricanes in neat rows outside the hangars, a perfect target for a strafing fighter, they were moved to dispersal pens. These were E-shaped earthwork walls, which would protect the aircraft from bomb blasts and shrapnel from all but a direct hit. The pens themselves were often located at the edges of the airfield, near woods or hedgerows, where the planes could be further hidden under camouflage netting. This combination of camouflage and dispersal completely changed the visual signature of an airfield. A German pilot flying over might see a pockmarked field and a few wrecked buildings, confirming the reports that the base was out of action. What he wouldn't see were the 24 fully armed and fueled fighters, hidden perfectly under the trees just a few hundred yards away, their pilots already scrambling to their cockpits, ready to meet him. As the Battle of Britain morphed into the nightly terror of the Blitz, the deception artists expanded their repertoire. If they could create fake airfields to protect the RAF, could they create fake cities to protect the civilians? The answer was yes. This new program, codenamed Starfish, was the brainchild of Colonel John Turner's department, the same minds behind the decoy airfields. The goal of a Starfish site was to replicate the appearance of a city on fire, drawing the German bombers away from their real targets like Coventry, Bristol, or London. The sites were complex and sophisticated. They were built a few miles away from the cities they were meant to protect, usually on open moorland or low-value farmland. They consisted of a series of carefully designed structures and pyrotechnics, all controlled remotely from a nearby bunker. The deception would begin with what were known as fire baskets. These were large, elevated grates filled with wood, shavings, and other flammable material. When lit, they would create the initial glow of a city hit by incendiary bombs. This was the lure. Once the German bombers were drawn in and began dropping their own high-explosive bombs, the Starfish crew would trigger the main effects. They had pipes filled with diesel oil that would be released and ignited, creating massive, boiling fireballs that looked exactly like a burning factory or fuel depot. They had boilers, steel tanks that would be heated until they exploded, scattering flaming material over a wide area, mimicking the effect of a delayed action bomb. They even had special effects to simulate the distinctive blue-white flash of an exploding electricity substation. The crews in the control bunkers could play these sites like a musical instrument. They could increase the intensity of the fires, create new explosions, and make it appear as if the fire services were failing to contain the blaze. For a German bomber crew, flying in the dark, navigating by maps, and looking for the telltale glow of a burning city, a well-lit Starfish site was an irresistible target. They would drop their entire bomb load on the fake inferno, convinced they had hit their mark. The program was astonishingly successful. It is estimated that Starfish sites saved thousands of lives and prevented untold destruction. On one night, a Starfish site imitating Cardiff drew so many bombs that the real city was almost untouched. Another site near Bristol was bombed on 6 separate occasions. The German crews returned to base. Mission reports filed. Targets confirmed destroyed. But the targets they were hitting were nothing more than a carefully orchestrated light show in an empty field. A ghost city built of fire and illusion. The physical deception of fake airfields and burning cities was only one part of the equation. The other was a relentless campaign of psychological warfare, waged through action rather than words. The core of this strategy was to project an image of unbreakable resilience, to create a sense of confusion and frustration in the minds of the German pilots and their commanders. And the key to this was the speed of repair. When a real airfield was hit, and it was hit hard, the German High Command expected it to be out of action for days, if not weeks. That was the logical, engineering reality. A 500-pound bomb could blast a crater 30 feet across and 10 feet deep in a runway. Filling that would take time, machinery, and materials. What the Germans couldn't fathom was the existence of the RAF's secret weapon, the Airfield Damage Repair Units. These were teams of civilian engineers and laborers, many of them veterans of building Britain's new road network. They were experts in tarmac, concrete, and earth moving, and they worked miracles. The moment a bombing raid ended, even as the smoke was still clearing, these teams would swarm onto the airfield. They had a simple, brutally effective system. They didn't try to permanently repair the crater. They would simply bulldoze rubble and earth back into the hole, compact it down with heavy rollers, and lay a quick-setting layer of tarmac or metal grating over the top. The goal wasn't a perfect runway. It was a usable one. They could get a fighter strip operational again in a matter of hours. This had a profound psychological effect. A German bomber crew would risk their lives to attack Biggin Hill at noon. They would see their bombs hit squarely on the runways. They would fly home convinced that they had crippled the base. Then, just a few hours later, a second wave of bombers would approach Biggin Hill, only to be met by squadrons of Hurricanes rising from the very same crippled airfield. The reports back to German intelligence must have been baffling. Pilots would insist they had destroyed the runways, yet the British were still operating. This created a powerful narrative of doubt. Were their bombs defective? Was their aiming off? Or were the British somehow invincible? This sense of futility was incredibly demoralizing. Combined with the decoy sights that seemed to soak up bombs with no effect, it began to wear down the confidence of the Luftwaffe. They were fighting an enemy that simply refused to die, an enemy that could seemingly raise its bases from the dead. The British weren't just repairing their runways. They were repairing their pilots' morale and systematically dismantling the enemies. The true, unsung heroes of the Battle of Britain were not in the cockpit. They were on the ground, covered in mud, grease, and sweat. They were the men of the airfield damage repair units, and their work was what made the entire deception strategy possible. Without their 24-hour miracle, the illusion of invincibility would have shattered. Their job was brutally hard and incredibly dangerous. The first task after a raid was to find and defuse any unexploded bombs. This was the job of the bomb disposal squads, a task requiring nerves of steel. They would walk the cratered fields, looking for the telltale signs of a bomb that had buried itself deep in the earth without detonating. One wrong move, and their work was over. Once the field was declared safe, the repair gangs moved in. The scenes were almost biblical. Under the harsh glare of portable floodlights at night, or in the frantic daylight hours between raids, they would attack the craters. They didn't have sophisticated modern equipment. They used shovels, picks, wheelbarrows, and a fleet of bulldozers and steamrollers. The process was a masterclass in organized chaos. A foreman would direct teams to a crater. Men would pour in, shoveling dirt and rubble back into the hole. Others would arrive with lorry loads of hardcore, broken bricks, stones, anything solid, to form a base. Then came the bulldozers, pushing earth from the crater's rim back into the center, leveling and compacting it with each pass. Finally, the steamrollers would chug back and forth, flattening the surface until it was solid enough to bear the weight of a landing hurricane. They didn't always have tarmac to finish the job. Sometimes, they would use experimental solutions, like rolls of metal Sommerfeld tracking, a kind of portable runway, or simply compact the earth until it was hard as rock. The speed was breathtaking. A team of 200 men could fill a massive bomb crater on a main runway and have it serviceable in under 6 hours. They worked through rain and mud, often while enemy reconnaissance planes flew overhead, and sometimes while fresh attacks were developing. They were fueled by grit, endless cups of strong tea brought out by the RAF, and the certain knowledge that every minute they saved was another minute the fighters could be in the air. The Germans, with their precise engineering mindset, calculated repair times based on their own standards. They assumed it would take days. They couldn't conceive of this British method. Not perfect, just fast. It was this philosophy of good enough for now that kept the airfields alive and fighter command in the fight. While the repair gangs fixed the ground, another army of technicians was fixing the aircraft. The mechanics, fitters, and armorers of the RAF, known collectively and affectionately as ERCs, were the lifeblood of every squadron. Their work was relentless, highly skilled, and performed under unimaginable pressure. A fighter returning from combat was a mess. It could be riddled with bullet holes, leaking oil and hydraulic fluid, with its delicate aluminum skin torn and twisted. The ERC's job was to take this battered machine and make it airworthy again, often in less than an hour. The process began the moment the pilot shut down the engine. The ground crew would swarm the aircraft. The fitters would assess the structural damage, the riggers would check the flight controls, and the engine mechanics would immediately begin checking the powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine for damage. At the same time, the armorers would be rearming the 8 Browning machine guns, feeding long belts of .303 ammunition into the wings, while others would be refueling the plane from mobile Bowsers. Speed was everything. Every minute a plane spent on the ground was a minute it wasn't protecting the skies. The ingenuity of these ground crews was legendary. They became masters of improvisation. Official repair manuals were often thrown out the window. They developed battlefield techniques to get things done faster. A patch on a wing didn't need to be perfect. It just needed to hold for the next flight. They would use whatever materials they had to hand. There are stories of mechanics using chewing gum to temporarily seal a leaking pipe or hammering a metal cup into a bullet hole to plug it. Cannibalization was standard practice. A Hurricane that was too badly damaged to fly again would be ruthlessly stripped for parts. Its engine, propeller, undercarriage, instruments, anything usable, would be taken to keep other aircraft in the air. They created Frankenplanes, machines built from the wreckage of 2 or 3 others. This work often continued through the night, under blackout conditions. They would work by the faint light of a heavily shielded lamp, or even just by moonlight, their fingers numb with cold, every sound making them flinch, listening for the drone of an approaching bomber. The bond between the pilots and their ground crews was incredibly strong. A pilot's life depended entirely on the skill and dedication of the men who worked on his plane. They knew that the Irk who signed off on his Spitfire had been working for 36 hours straight, but they trusted him completely. This tireless, unseen work was the engine that powered Fighter Command. For every pilot in the air, there were at least 10 men on the ground making it possible. They were the ones who truly kept the RAF flying. In the nerve centers of the Dowding system, from the vast operations room at Bentley Priory to the sandbagged sector control rooms at the Airfields, another battle was being fought. This battle was fought not with guns, but with information, and its soldiers were the women of the WAF, the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. Their role was absolutely critical. Without them, the entire air defense network would have collapsed. The most visible of these women were the plotters. In the operations rooms, they stood around a huge map table representing their sector of airspace. They wore headsets, listening to the reports coming in from the radar stations and the observer corps. As a raid was detected, a plotter would place a block on the map, indicating its position, height, and the estimated number of enemy aircraft. With each new report, they would move the block across the map using long wooden rakes, creating a real-time picture of the air battle. It was a high-pressure, mentally taxing job. The fate of hundreds of pilots and millions of civilians depended on their speed and accuracy. One misplaced block could send a squadron to the wrong location, with disastrous consequences. Above them, in a balcony overlooking the map, sat the controllers. Their job was to watch the patterns unfold on the table below, and to make the split-second decisions about which squadrons to scramble and where to send them. They would speak directly to the pilots in the air, guiding them towards the enemy formations. The voices of the WAF radio operators were often the last thing a pilot heard before entering combat, and the first thing they heard on their return. But the WAFs did far more than just plot. They were radar operators, sitting in darkened rooms, staring at the faint green pulse on a cathode ray tube, trying to decipher the first signs of an incoming raid. They were communication specialists, maintaining the vital telephone and teletype lines that connected the entire system. They were drivers, ferrying pilots, equipment, and messages between dispersed sites, often during air raids. They were parachute packers, cooks, clerks, and even mechanics' assistants. They performed dozens of essential roles, freeing up men for combat duty. They endured the same dangers as the men. The operations rooms they worked in were primary targets. WAFs were killed and injured in the bombing raids on Biggin Hill, Kenly, and other stations. They showed incredible courage, often remaining at their posts, calmly plotting the course of the very bombs that were falling around them. In a war fought largely by men, the women of the WAF were the quiet, efficient, and indispensable heart of Britain's defense. Keeping hundreds of high-performance fighter aircraft armed and fueled in the middle of a relentless bombing campaign was a logistical nightmare. A Spitfire's Merlin engine was incredibly thirsty. It consumed 100-octane aviation fuel at a ferocious rate, especially during combat. After a single sortie, which might last only an hour, its tanks would be nearly empty. Its 8 machine guns, each firing at over 1,000 rounds per minute, could exhaust their ammunition in about 15 seconds of continuous firing. The constant need for fuel and bullets was the Achilles heel of any air force. The Germans knew this. Fuel depots and ammunition dumps were priority targets. A single well-placed bomb could create a cataclysmic explosion, destroying not just the supplies, but everything and everyone around them. Early in the battle, the RAF stored its fuel in large, obvious, above-ground tanks. After several of these were hit, creating spectacular and demoralizing infernos, the strategy had to change. The solution was dispersal and concealment. Instead of one large fuel depot, each airfield created dozens of smaller, hidden ones. Fuel was brought in by tanker trucks and decanted into thousands of simple 2-gallon cans. These cans were then hidden in ditches, under trees, in nearby farm buildings, anywhere they would be safe from a bombing raid. When a fighter landed, a swarm of ground crew would descend on it, not with a fuel hose from a large Bowser, but with dozens of these 2-gallon cans, manually pouring the fuel into the wings. It was slow, laborious, and inefficient, but it was safe. A bomb could destroy one small stack of cans, but the airfield's main supply would be intact. The same principle was applied to ammunition. Boxes of 303 rounds were stored in small, blast-proof enclosures scattered around the perimeter of the airfield. The armorers would bring the ammunition to the aircraft on trolleys, load the guns, and the empty boxes would be taken away. This dispersal of resources was a crucial part of the survival strategy. It made the airfields incredibly resilient. The Germans could bomb the main technical site. They could destroy the hangars and workshops, but they couldn't find and destroy the hundreds of tiny, scattered caches of fuel and ammunition that were the true lifeblood of the station. This logistical foresight, born from hard-won experience, ensured that even on the most heavily damaged airfields, if a fighter could find a strip of land to take off from, it would do so with a full tank of fuel and fully loaded guns. Amidst the constant threat of death, the physical exhaustion, and the sight of daily destruction, the single most important factor that kept the RAF fighting was morale. It was a strange and potent mixture of grim determination, black humor, and an unshakable, unspoken belief that they could not fail. For the ground crews, life was a cycle of endless work. They were pushed to the very limits of human endurance. Yet they found ways to cope. The NAFI van, serving up endless mugs of steaming hot sweet tea and simple food, became a symbol of British resilience. A 10-minute tea break in the middle of rearming a squadron was not a luxury. It was an essential ritual that kept men on their feet. Humor, often dark and cynical, was a vital defense mechanism. They would joke about the poor aim of the German bombers, or place bets on how many craters the next raid would leave. This gallows humor was a way of controlling their fear, of looking death in the eye and laughing at it. The pilots, often seen as glamorous knights of the air, faced a different kind of pressure. They lived with the constant, gnawing knowledge that each scramble could be their last. The odds were stacked against them. They would fly several sorties a day, coming down only to refuel and rearm before going back up again. The physical and mental strain was immense. Yet their morale, for the most part, held firm. The squadron became their family. They shared a unique bond, forged in combat. Off-duty, they would release the tension in the local pub or in the grand country houses that had been requisitioned as officers' messes. They sang songs, drank, and tried to forget the empty chairs at the dinner table. There was a fierce pride in their work. They knew they were the thin blue line defending their homes and families. This sense of purpose, this feeling that the fate of the nation rested on their shoulders, gave them a strength that transcended fear and exhaustion. The leadership of men like Dowding and the inspirational group commanders like Keith Park and Trafford Lee-Mallory was also crucial. They were visible, they shared the risks, and they communicated a clear sense of strategy and confidence. This combination of frontline camaraderie, a powerful sense of duty, and resilient leadership created a fighting force that, according to all the logical calculations of the enemy, should have been broken. But it was not. It was this intangible, unquantifiable spirit that the German intelligence reports could never account for. Let's walk through a typical attack during the height of the battle to see how all these elements, the deception, the repair, the ground crews, and the Dowding system, came together in a symphony of organized chaos. The day begins with a faint signal on a radar screen at a coastal station like Ventnor on the Isle of Wight. A RAF operator, her eyes trained for the slightest anomaly, spots the telltale blip of a large formation assembling over the Pas de Calais in France. The information is instantly relayed to Fighter Command Headquarters. On the giant map table at Bentley Priory, a plotter places a marker. Hostile 70+, the controller announces. The raid is heading northwest, towards Kent. The cogs of the Dowding system begin to turn. The order is passed down to number 11 Group Headquarters at Uxbridge. The group captain, Keith Park, assesses the threat. His job is to commit the minimum number of fighters necessary to stop the bombers, keeping the rest in reserve. He selects his squadrons. The order flashes down the telephone lines to the sector stations: Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, Scramble. At Biggin Hill, which was officially destroyed according to German reports yesterday, the scramble bell rings. The sound cuts through the air, electrifying the base. Pilots, who have been lounging in deck chairs by their dispersed aircraft, sprint towards their cockpits. They don't run to the main hangars. They run to the camouflaged earthwork pens, where their hurricanes are waiting. The ground crews, who have been working all night to patch the runway and refuel the planes, are already in action. They help the pilots strap in, the engine starters are plugged in, and with a cough, a belch of smoke, and a roar, the Merlin engines come to life. One by one, the fighters bump across the grass, find the hastily repaired section of runway, and claw their way into the sky. The whole process, from the first ring of the bell to the last fighter being airborne, takes less than 4 minutes. In the sector operations room, the WAF plotters are tracking both the enemy raid and their own responding squadrons. The controller, watching the map, guides the Biggin Hill squadron, giving them vectors and altitudes to achieve the perfect interception point, ideally with the advantage of height and with the sun at their backs. As the fighters climb, they can see their home base below them, a patchwork of fresh earth, camouflaged buildings, and hidden activity. To the enemy, it looks like a ruin. To them, it's home, and it's working. Now, shift perspective. You are a 20-year-old pilot officer, climbing steeply in your Spitfire. The oxygen mask is tight on your face. The roar of the Merlin engine in front of you is deafening. Your squadron is a collection of 12 aircraft, climbing in formation through the scattered clouds over the green fields of Kent. The voice of the controller crackles in your ears. Vector 120, Angels 20, bandits approaching Folkestone. Angels 20 means 20,000 feet. You push the throttle forward. Your eyes are constantly scanning the sky, a vast, empty blue expanse. You're not just looking for the enemy. You're looking for the tiny black specks that could be Messerschmitt 109s, the deadly German fighters that will be flying high above their bombers, waiting to pounce. Below you, you can see your airfield. Just yesterday, you watched a wave of Dorniers turn it into a smoking, cratered mess. You landed on a secondary grass strip and slept for 4 hours in a trench while the repair crews worked under floodlights. This morning, you took off from the main runway. Seeing your base functioning, seeing fighters taking off, gave you a surge of confidence that is impossible to describe. It felt like a victory in itself. It was a tangible, visible sign that you were not beaten. It meant the system was working. The ground crews were holding the line. It made you feel part of something unbreakable. The controller's voice comes again, calmer now. Tally-ho! Bandits 10 o'clock, slightly below. And then you see them. A huge formation of German bombers, Dornier 17s, arranged in a tight V formation, glinting in the sun. Above them, you spot the escort, the 109s, weaving back and forth. Your squadron leader gives the order. Red section, attack the bombers. Blue section, engage the escort. Go. The carefully ordered formation breaks apart. You select a bomber on the edge of the formation, push the stick forward into a dive, and the calm is shattered. The sky, which was empty seconds ago, is now filled with aircraft, tracer fire, and chaos. You line up the Dornier in your gun sight, your thumb hovering over the red firing button on your control column. The confidence you felt at takeoff, born from the resilience of your destroyed airfield, now turns into focused aggression. You are not just defending the sky, you are avenging your home. Let's climb into the cockpit of a Messerschmitt 109, flying escort duty high above the bombers. You are Lieutenant Hans Schmidt, a veteran of the campaigns in Poland and France. You are confident, professional, and you fly the best fighter aircraft in the world. Your mission today is to protect the bombers hitting the rail yards in South London. Intelligence has assured you that the mission will be easy. The primary RAF fighter bases in the area, Kenley and Biggin Hill, are, for all practical purposes, non-operational. Your reconnaissance photos have confirmed this. You expect to face, at most, a handful of fighters, probably launched from bases further north, arriving late and low on fuel. As you cross the coast, you look down at the English countryside. It looks peaceful, green, but your eyes are searching for the telltale signs of enemy airfields. You spot what looks like Biggin Hill, and it matches the photos. The runways are clearly cratered, and a large hangar shows signs of fire damage. The report was accurate. The base is a mess. But then, your wingman's voice crackles in your headset, sharp with alarm. Spitfires! 9 o'clock high! You wrench your head around and your blood runs cold. A full squadron of 12 Spitfires is diving on you from out of the sun. This is impossible. Where did they come from? A second report comes in from the bomber crews below. They are being attacked by hurricanes. A whole squadron of them. They seem to have appeared from nowhere, right out of the ground near Biggin Hill. Confusion turns to anger. You have been lied to. Or worse, intelligence is completely, utterly wrong. You break formation and engage the Spitfires, entering a chaotic, swirling dogfight. But the psychological damage is already done. The element of surprise is gone. Instead of an easy escort mission, you are in a fight for your life against a dozen enemy fighters that, according to your maps and reports, should not exist. When you land back at your base in France, hours later, low on fuel, and with 2 aircraft from your squadron missing, your report to the intelligence officer is filled with frustration. They are still there. Biggin Hill is operating. We were met by a full squadron. The intelligence officer looks at you with skepticism. He pulls out the reconnaissance photo from that very morning. He points at the craters. That is not possible, Lieutenant. Look. You must have been mistaken. They must have come from a different base. But you know what you saw. You saw fighters rising from a ghost airfield. And for the first time, you feel a flicker of doubt about the certainty of German victory. Back in France, at the headquarters of the Luftwaffe's intelligence branch, Colonel Beppo Schmid is facing a growing pile of contradictory evidence. On one hand, he has his photographs. They are his hard, undeniable proof. They show craters, wrecked buildings, and deserted airfields. His photo interpreters, the best in the world, have analyzed these images and declared the targets destroyed. Their analysis is logical, methodical, and based on physical evidence. The numbers of destroyed British aircraft, both in the air and on the ground, continue to mount. On paper, Fighter Command has ceased to be an effective fighting force. But on the other hand, he has the pilot reports, dozens of them, all telling the same story. We were met by heavy fighter resistance over Kent. They came out of nowhere, right from the area around Kenley. Their numbers are not decreasing. If anything, they are stronger. Schmid and his team were trapped by their own doctrine. They were data-driven, but they were only looking at one kind of data. They trusted the camera more than the human eye. They reasoned that the pilots, in the heat of battle, were prone to exaggeration and confusion. It was more plausible that a pilot misidentified where the enemy fighters came from than it was for an airfield, photographed in a state of ruin, to launch a full squadron. Hubris also played a significant role. The German High Command had a sense of intellectual and military superiority. They believed their methods were infallible. The idea that the British, whom they considered amateurs at total warfare, could be running a sophisticated, large-scale deception campaign was almost unthinkable. It was dismissed as outlandish. So they found other ways to explain the data. Perhaps the British had a secret, vast reserve of fighters hidden somewhere. Perhaps they were bringing them in from other parts of the country, leaving the north undefended. They theorized that the RAF was throwing its last remaining pilots and planes into the fight in a final, desperate gamble. Every explanation was considered, except the simplest one, that they were being tricked. This failure of imagination was their undoing. By refusing to believe the reports of their own pilots and clinging to the evidence of the photographs, they continued to believe the RAF was broken. And this belief led Göring to make his fateful decision to shift the attacks to London, a decision that would give Fighter Command the breathing room it so desperately needed to survive. The 15th of September, 1940. This date is now celebrated as Battle of Britain Day. It was the day the Luftwaffe launched its largest, most concentrated attack yet, an all-out assault designed to be the final knockout blow. It was the day the German High Command believed they would finally sweep the last remnants of the RAF from the sky. Two massive waves of bombers, escorted by hundreds of fighters, were sent to attack London. Göring believed he would face minimal resistance. His intelligence chief, Beppo Schmid, had assured him that Fighter Command was down to its last handful of fighters. The sector airfields in the southeast were still listed on the German maps as heavily damaged or non-operational. As the first wave of over 600 German aircraft crossed the English coast, the doubting system went into overdrive. Every radar station, every observer post was feeding information into the nerve center. At No. 11 Group Headquarters, Keith Park and his controllers began to commit their squadrons. But this time, it was different. For weeks, Park had been forced to feed his squadrons into the fight piecemeal, always holding some back, always trying to conserve his strength. But today, he knew this was the climax. He threw everything he had into the battle. Squadrons from No. 11 Group rose to meet the enemy. Then, squadrons from the neighboring No. 10 and No. 12 groups were called in. For the first time, the Luftwaffe was not facing a handful of squadrons, but the coordinated might of the entire RAF in southern England. The sky over London became a vast, terrifying arena of aerial combat. German bomber crews, who had been told to expect little resistance, were stunned. They were attacked relentlessly from the moment they crossed the coast until the moment they turned for home. They saw something they had never seen before. Squadron after squadron of Spitfires and Hurricanes, perfectly positioned, attacking in waves. The carefully orchestrated deceptions and the heroic repair efforts of the previous weeks now paid their ultimate dividend. The airfields that the Germans had dismissed as ruins, Kenley, Biggin Hill, Hornchurch, Debden, were all fully operational. They were launching, recovering, rearming, and refueling aircraft at an incredible rate, feeding a constant stream of fresh fighters into the battle. A German bomber pilot later described the shock. "We saw them coming down on us, and there seemed to be no end to them. We thought the English were finished, but there they were. It was a terrible shock." By the end of the day, the Luftwaffe had suffered devastating losses. While the exact numbers are still debated, they lost around 60 aircraft, with many more damaged. More importantly, their morale was shattered. They had thrown their best at the RAF, and the RAF had not just held, but had triumphed. They had seen with their own eyes that the intelligence reports were wrong. The RAF was not beaten. It was strong, organized, and waiting for them. The 15th of September didn't end the Battle of Britain, but it broke the back of the Luftwaffe's strategy. They had gambled everything on a knockout blow, and had failed. The invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion, was postponed indefinitely. The ghost airfields had done their job. Now that the climax of the battle is past, let's take a moment to look at the numbers, to quantify the success of this incredible deception. How much damage was actually done, and how much was diverted? The statistics paint a stunning picture. Between August and September 1940, the Luftwaffe dropped thousands of tons of bombs on the sector stations of No. 11 Group. In total, over 100 attacks were made on the 7 key sector airfields. Biggin Hill was attacked 12 times in just 2 weeks. Kenley was hit with over 500 bombs. According to German damage assessments, these airfields should have been rendered completely unusable for the rest of the war. Yet, the records of fighter command show a different story. Not a single one of these vital sector stations was ever put out of action for more than 24 hours. The 24-hour miracle of the repair crews was not a myth. It was a statistical fact. The decoy program was equally successful. There were approximately 500 decoy sites built across the UK during the war, including the K sites, Q sites, and Starfish sites. It is estimated that these sites were targeted in over 500 separate bombing raids. This means that hundreds of tons of bombs, thousands of man-hours, and vast quantities of fuel were expended by the Luftwaffe in attacking completely worthless targets. Every bomb that fell on a fake hurricane made of canvas was a bomb that didn't hit a real one. Every German bomber that circled a Starfish site trying to pinpoint its target was a bomber that wasn't dropping its load on a real city. The cost of the deception program was minuscule compared to the cost of the assets it protected. A dummy hurricane cost a few £100 to build. A real one cost over £5,000, not to mention the priceless life of its pilot and the skilled work of its ground crew. The decoy airfields were, pound for pound, one of the most cost-effective defensive weapons Britain possessed. But the most important statistic is the one that is hardest to measure: time. The deception, combined with the rapid repairs, bought fighter command time. Time to rest its exhausted pilots. Time to repair its battered aircraft. Time to train new recruits. The German decision to shift attacks from the airfields to London on September 7th, a decision based entirely on the flawed intelligence that the airfields were destroyed, is now seen by historians as the critical turning point. That 2-week respite was precisely what the RAF needed to recover its strength for the final, decisive battles, like the one on September 15th. The success of the airfield deception strategies in 1940 was not a one-off trick. It was the beginning of a whole new doctrine of military illusion that the British would master and deploy throughout the rest of the war. The lessons learned in the fields of Kent were refined, expanded, and used on a truly epic scale in other theaters of war. In the deserts of North Africa, British deception units under the command of Jasper Maskelyne, the magician, and others created entire phantom armies. For the Battle of El Alamein, they built thousands of dummy tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces. They created a fake army group, complete with its own radio traffic and a massive, fake supply pipeline made from old tin cans, to convince Rommel that the main British attack would come from the south. When the real attack came from the north, the Germans were caught completely off guard. The techniques for building dummy equipment were perfected. They created inflatable rubber tanks that could be deployed by a handful of men in minutes. They built dummy landing craft to fool German reconnaissance in the Mediterranean. The experience with starfish sights also evolved. The Royal Engineers became experts in what they called controlled pyrotechnics, able to simulate anything from a burning city to a full-scale naval battle using lights and explosives. But the ultimate expression of this wartime deception was Operation Fortitude, the massive, complex plan to deceive the Germans about the location of the D-Day landings in 1944. This was the culmination of everything learned since 1940. They created a fictional army, the first U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, under the command of the famous General George S. Patton. This ghost army was based in the southeast of England, opposite the Pas-de-Calais. They built thousands of dummy landing craft in the harbors of Kent. They filled the fields with inflatable tanks and trucks. They generated a massive amount of fake radio traffic, simulating the daily communications of an army of 1 million men preparing to invade. The deception was so successful that even weeks after the real landings in Normandy, Hitler and his high command remained convinced that Normandy was just a feint, and that the main invasion was still to come at Calais. They held back powerful panzer divisions in the Calais region, waiting for an invasion that would never happen. Those divisions could have turned the tide in Normandy. The seeds of this D-Day deception, a strategy that saved tens of thousands of Allied lives, were sown 4 years earlier by the men who built canvas hurricanes and lit fires in empty fields to protect the airfields of Fighter Command. For years after the war, the full extent of the deception campaign remained a closely guarded secret. The official histories focused on the bravery of the pilots, the brilliance of the Spitfire, and the leadership of Dowding. The stories of the decoy sites and the rapid repair crews were largely untold, buried in classified documents. The German commanders went to their graves believing, for the most part, that they had simply underestimated the industrial capacity and the sheer number of pilots the British possessed. High-ranking Luftwaffe officers, interrogated after the war, expressed utter disbelief when shown evidence of the decoy program. General Adolf Galland, one of Germany's top fighter aces, admitted that while they had sometimes suspected decoys, they had no idea of the scale or sophistication of the operation. He acknowledged that the constant, baffling resilience of the RAF airfields had been a major source of frustration and had contributed to the erosion of Luftwaffe morale. The German belief in their own technical and intelligence superiority made it difficult for them to accept that they had been so thoroughly fooled by such simple, theatrical tricks. The release of official documents in the 60s and 70s finally allowed the full story to be told. Historians began to piece together the narrative, using Air Ministry records, construction logs for the decoy sites, and the personal memoirs of the men and women who had been involved. It was a revelation. It showed that the victory in the Battle of Britain was not just won in the air. It was won in the workshops of film studios, in the trenches of the Q sites, by the bulldozers of the repair gangs, and on the plotting tables of the WAF. It was a victory of a system, a victory of a whole people mobilized for defense. The story resonated with the public. It was a classic tale of the underdog outsmarting the powerful bully, of ingenuity triumphing over brute force. It added a new layer of appreciation for the men and women who had fought the battle on the ground, whose courage had never been recognized with medals or public acclaim. The revelation didn't diminish the heroism of the few, the pilots, but it broadened the story to include the many, the thousands of unknown heroes whose work had made that heroism possible. The legacy of the Battle of Britain is often encapsulated in Winston Churchill's immortal words. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. He was, of course, referring to the fighter pilots. Their courage, skill, and sacrifice were undeniably central to the victory. They were the tip of the spear. But the story of the secret airfields reminds us that a spear is useless without a shaft. The victory belonged not just to the few, but to the many. It belonged to the RAF plotter who stayed at her table while the bombs fell, ensuring the pilots knew where to go. It belonged to the mechanic who worked for 48 hours straight, his hands raw and bleeding, to get one more hurricane back in the air. It belonged to the civilian laborer who drove his bulldozer towards a burning, unexploded bomb to fill a crater in a runway. It belonged to the two-man crew in a ditch, deliberately drawing the fire of a dozen bombers onto themselves to save a real airfield miles away. And it belonged to the engineers and artists who imagined a world of phantom planes and ghost cities. This story redefines our understanding of heroism. It shows that courage comes in many forms. It isn't just about facing the enemy in combat. It's about the quiet, unglamorous, and often terrifying work of keeping the war machine running. It's the courage of the bomb disposal expert, the resilience of the repair crew, the precision of the radar operator. The Battle of Britain was won by an integrated system, a network where every single person, every single role was vital. The pilot in his Spitfire was the final, critical link in a long chain that began with a woman peering at a radar screen, was forged by mechanics and armorers, and was protected by a brilliant web of illusion and deception. When we remember the few, we must also remember the vast, invisible army on the ground that held them up, patched them together, and guided them home. Their legacy is a testament to the idea that in the darkest of times, it is not just the strength of the sword that matters, but the ingenuity of the mind and the unbreakable spirit of a people determined to survive. So, what is the final, enduring lesson from this incredible story of deception and resilience? It is a powerful reminder that warfare is not just a matter of numbers, technology, or brute force. It is, and always has been, a contest of wills and of minds. The Luftwaffe in 1940 had more planes, more experienced pilots, and a fearsome reputation. On paper, they should have won. Their strategy of destroying fighter command on the ground was sound, logical, and it came terrifyingly close to succeeding. But they were defeated not by a superior weapon, but by a superior idea. They were defeated by an opponent who refused to play by their rules, who met industrial might with improvisation, who countered meticulous planning with chaotic, rapid repair, and who fought a war of illusion that the German mindset was simply not equipped to comprehend. The secret of the RAF Airfields is a story about the power of hiding in plain sight. It demonstrates that sometimes the most effective defense is not a thicker wall or a bigger gun, but a clever piece of misdirection. It's a story of how a handful of artists, engineers, and stagehands could, with canvas, paint, and light, have as much impact on the outcome of a battle as a squadron of fighter planes. It proves that the morale of an army and a nation is a weapon in itself. The sight of those destroyed airfields continuing to function day after day did more than just launch fighters. It projected an aura of invincibility that bolstered British spirits and demoralized the enemy. Ultimately, this is a human story. It's about people who, when faced with overwhelming force, chose not to break, but to adapt. They used their wits, their hands, and their sheer stubbornness to create a reality that their enemy could not understand. They turned fields into stages, runways into phoenixes rising from the ashes, and in doing so, they didn't just save their Air Force. They saved their country, and perhaps the world.